In 2001, Nintendo came to E3 looking to remind the world who it was and what they would be up to next. They were at the end of the road for the Nintendo 64 and were winding down the Game Boy Color. In its place, they were going for a clean slate, replacing both in tandem with the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance. They pulled a few rabbits out of their hat, surprising the world with announcements like Super Smash Bros. Melee and Pikmin, while Factor 5 wowed everyone with the graphical splendor that was Rogue Squadron 2. But below the surface, beyond the headliners, there was an underlying unease, an uncertainty, a lingering question. Where were the big guns? Every Nintendo console to date had launched with a headlining Mario game. Yet, outside of Super Smash Bros., Mario was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Luigi was headlining the GameCube's launch, with some kind of survival horror parody. Pikmin was well received and eagerly anticipated, but no one was really sure if it would be a heavy hitter or an interesting one-off. Wave Race was graphically impressive, but was much closer to being a remaster of the N64 original than a whole new game. Third parties brought some more software, but just about none of it was original or made for the GameCube specifically. Almost all of the third-party titles shown were ports of games already released or releasing first for the PS2. The rest were ports from other places, like the Dreamcast, or in the case of Super Monkey Ball, an arcade game, just about the closest thing a third party would get to showing something new for the GameCube. The entirety of what carried the day for Nintendo at that show was the games itself and its second-party partners had to show, like Star Fox Adventures, Eternal Darkness, and Rogue Squadron 2, as well as very vague early CG videos for Metroid Prime, Mario Kart, Raven Blade, cameo Elements of Power, and Donkey Kong Racing. All of these were more so just announcements of titles than actually showing anything substantial or playable. So with Nintendo headliners that appeared to be more from its B tier of experimental franchises, a few genuinely top-tier looking titles from its partner companies, and a small plethora of ports from other systems to fill in the remaining gaps, the GameCube went into launch season with a relatively weak hand compared to its competition. The PlayStation 2 held just about every card it possibly could. It had sold over 10 million consoles already, and would sell through 20 million by the end of the year. It had every third-party company in the industry eating out of the palm of its hand, and every conceivable game genre covered, and several new ones no one had ever seen before. They were also using their experience during the PlayStation 1 era to identify and start reeling in their own partner studios that they could count on to make some exclusive software, like Naughty Dog. Microsoft's E3 2001 showing was decidedly much more mixed, as much of its software wasn't ready for prime time, and even headliners like Halo failed to impress since they were still in their beta forms. But they were successfully lining up the needed third-party support to make sure they'd have all the same major titles the other two systems would have, and were going to throw around $500 million in marketing to launch the system and make its beachhead stick. E3 2001 was also the going-away party for Sega's Dreamcast, and the last time the company would be showcasing its own console at the show, which served as an ominous warning to the remaining players that the console wars are not risk-free, and surviving to the next round wasn't always guaranteed, regardless of your pedigree. But E3 2001 was all about launching new consoles, and finally getting the sixth generation of systems underway. With that launch season behind them now, E3 2002 would be about what that next generation would look like as it shifted into full gear. For Sony, that would mean declaring total victory. No joke. At E3 2002, Sony declared that the console war was over and they had won. As arrogant as that might sound, they were entirely correct. By May 2002, Sony had already sold 30 million PlayStation 2 systems worldwide, which was over 3 times the combined sales of the Xbox and GameCube. It was also a number that the Xbox and GameCube would never be able to reach, as neither system would get to even 25 million in lifetime sales by the end of their lives on the marketplace. Sony would not let up or rest on their laurels, though, as just like at E3 2001, they had every conceivable third party in their corner. Even ones like Capcom or Sega that leaned closer to Nintendo still couldn't pass up having major titles exclusive to the PS2. They also continued their march towards establishing their own internal and satellite studios, as they heavily pushed the latest creation from Insomniac Software called Ratchet & Clank. Meanwhile, Microsoft was feeling its oats quite a bit more in 2002 than it had a year earlier, with Halo becoming a smash hit, and its system sporting a fairly respectable and diverse lineup of new and exclusive games. It had managed thus far to edge Nintendo out in terms of sales, just slightly, and now was looking to try and capitalize on its second place position to try and at least get within striking distance of Sony. Naturally, with Halo having carried the console to this point, they did the most predictably logical thing and pumped out a short trailer, basically just announcing that there would be a Halo 2. Most importantly, though, they were putting the majority of their eggs into the basket of online gaming, since the major focus of their E3 2002 showcase would be unveiling, explaining, and demonstrating Xbox Live, slated to start up in time for the holidays, with a strong lineup of early titles led by Unreal Championship and MechAssault. This would be one of the major competition points and points of differentiation for the PS2 and the Xbox, as Sony was also responding to the push for online gaming by announcing its own plans for online systems on the PS2. By the end of the summer, they would be shipping a network adapter for $40 that would feature both a dial-up and Ethernet port for broadband connections. While the Xbox shipped with only broadband Ethernet connectivity, it was a built-in part of the console. No additional investment was needed. But Sony was taking a hands-off response to setting up the online gaming ecosystem on the PS2, meaning that they would not be charging players or third-party companies any kind of access or maintenance fees, and as a result, was also not providing any centralized or organized service for online gaming on the system either. They would lead the way with some major demonstration titles like SOCOM, which would come bundled with a headset, and Twisted Metal Black Online, which would be free for those who sent in their registration for the network adapter. Meanwhile, though, Microsoft was making its Xbox Live service more comprehensive and more centralized and controlled by Microsoft, as they would be establishing a central clearinghouse for game services and for game players, while charging players $50 a year for the service, while throwing in an Xbox headset for good measure. In this respect, Sony was playing to its much bigger and more diverse audience of players, and the preference of the major third-party studios that were backing them, such as Electronic Arts, who would only be bringing online gameplay to its sports games on the PS2 that year, while the Xbox versions would remain offline only, effectively boycotting the Xbox Live service. Sega would be begrudgingly supporting both, but when asked about the different strategies, the company who had gone through all of this first would tell EGM that it thought Sony's model was better, since the developers would be freer to set up online infrastructure that worked best for their games, and that it was incredibly important to allow for dial-up users to participate in online gaming, since the vast majority of internet users in 2002 were using dial-up, and broadband was still a pretty small corner of the market. And after all, they themselves had proven on the Dreamcast that just about any game could be done online via dial-up, since they had sports, first-person shooters, an MMO, and even voice chat all over dial-up. Aside from the showdown over online strategies, the newborn console generation was also descending into a different kind of war that hadn't been seen in a while, a price war, as Sony led the way by cutting the PlayStation 2's price from $300 down to $200, which in turn forced Microsoft's hand to do the same and match them at $200, which dramatically upped the losses they would be incurring on each system sold. Sony was also selling the PS2 as a loss leader, but their hardware started rolling off assembly lines over 2 years ago, so some cost savings were likely at this point for them. While Microsoft had thrown together the Xbox from off-the-shelf components, with little regard for the economics of consolidating its initial design, any more than they had considered the size of the unit itself. They had rushed to market and now had to sell the system at a competitive price, regardless of how much they had to spend to throw together the behemoth PC build that was the Xbox. Microsoft was also following the price-cutting trend because they had seen much softer than expected sales in both Europe and Japan. Europe might be salvageable given the right moves, but in Japan, the Xbox fulfilled all expectations in being dead on arrival. With average weekly sales so low, they somehow tracked behind the sales of the long-since discontinued Dreamcast, which was no longer being manufactured and had shipped its last units to retail before Christmas of 2001. So their fresh, new Xboxes were being outsold by whatever drips and drabs of remaining Sega hardware was still working its way off Japanese retailers' shelves in 2002. One good thing to emerge from the Xbox's Japanese release was the redesign of its controller for the Japanese market, known as the Controller S model. After the significant bad press and consumer ridicule and complaints the Xbox had fielded due to its large and unusually unwieldy controller, again thrown together to make it to market in time for launch. In the weeks leading up to E3, Microsoft had started to introduce that Japanese Controller S to the North American market as a new optional controller that many Xbox owners promptly rushed out to buy, as its improved ergonomics was incredibly in demand among its new console owners. So with Sony and Microsoft showing their hands and sizing each other up, all eyes turned to Nintendo. What would their response be to all of this? What would they do to try and regain the initiative, and at least try and pull ahead of Microsoft? All of that will be answered in their E3 2002 press conference. Nintendo of America's Vice President Peter McDougal took the stage and ran through the highlights of what Nintendo's points were going to be for 2002. He noted that after spending 2001 focusing on launching new hardware, they would be spending 2002 just focusing on launching new software to support those systems. With the GameCube finally releasing in Europe just days before the E3 show and selling through 80% of its 500,000 units, the hardware rollout was complete, and the last console launch of this generation was finally done. Most importantly, he emphasized that in the next 9 months, from the end of the summer through the post-Christmas winter of 2003, Nintendo would be releasing the strongest lineup of titles that they'd ever released, all in this one window, as they promised to produce the trifecta of their 3 most famous and towering franchises at that time: Mario, Zelda, and Metroid. But they also wanted to acknowledge that they would not be able to make the GameCube successful with only their own games. For that, Nintendo of Japan's newly anointed leader, Satoru Iwata, would take the stage to announce or confirm new collaborations with some famous Japanese studios and Nintendo. Starting with confirming the long-simmering rumors that Squaresoft was indeed returning to Nintendo platforms, with games in development for both the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube. Previous antagonist and Sony booster Namco would also be working closely with Nintendo to develop a new Star Fox title in the future. While both of the most famous Japanese arcade studios, Namco and Sega, were both partnering with Nintendo to release a brand new arcade board based directly off of the GameCube, with the resulting 3-way partnership giving way for the board to be called the Triforce board. And all 3 companies would be making games for the arcade system in conjunction with the GameCube. With its efforts to highlight new inroads with major Japanese studios done, McDougal retook the stage to answer the most often cited challenge for Nintendo in trying to compete for the older hardcore gamer. He acknowledged the company was going to be stepping up in 2002 with the GameCube to try and court that ever-elusive audience for them, and loaded up 3 big games they'd be launching in those same 9 months that were all supposed to appeal to this demographic, showing trailers for Metroid Prime, Eternal Darkness, and Resident Evil 0. This was a very key initiative for Nintendo in this moment, and the Resident Evil series was showing why. The remake of Resident Evil for the GameCube had just come out weeks before the E3 show, and since its release, GameCube sales in North America had risen steadily and managed to outpace the Xbox, putting Nintendo in the number 2 spot for the moment. Of course, there was one area where Nintendo was number 1 and would remain dominant, and that was in the handheld space, where the press conference briefly pivoted to highlight the overwhelming success of their new handheld with 6 million units sold just in North America in the last 11 months, and expectations to double them by next year, with 300 games expected to be available for the holidays. The games shown for the Game Boy Advance were a mix of continuing existing handheld franchises, like Game & Watch Gallery 4, Golden Sun 2, and Super Mario Advance 3, plus well-desired Super Nintendo ports, like Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. There were also games made to complement their GameCube counterparts, like Metroid Fusion and Magical Quest starring Mickey and Minnie. This gave them their main talking point to pivot back to their main focus in establishing that synergy between their two platforms, which they put under the simple banner of connectivity. Here, Iwata would return and quickly address one form of connectivity that everyone else was talking about: online connectivity. Here he laid out Nintendo's problems with the rush to online gaming, saying that they believed in universal access to gaming, and at the moment, internet services were not available to everyone, while standard offline games were. Second, there was not a demonstrable, profitable business model for online gaming yet. A fair point, since watching Sega bet so heavily on online gaming nearly cost them the entire company just a year ago. So Nintendo would be taking the most indifferent and hands-off approach of all three consoles by a long shot. Like Sony, they would be putting out network adapters, in this case, separate broadband or dial-up pieces for customers to choose based on their needs. They would also be declining to charge any access fees or licensing fees for third parties or end users, and thus would not be standing up any online infrastructure of their own for the GameCube. But with the hardware to be available that fall, and the technical possibility finally real, they could announce their first online game for the GameCube, as Sega's long-promised Phantasy Star Online would be coming to the system that fall alongside the network adapters as a fully online title, bringing the beloved Dreamcast MMORPG to a new home on the GameCube. After tidily sweeping its meager online plans under the rug, they proceeded to present their excited alternative to online connectivity, Game Boy Advance to GameCube connectivity, which they asserted that everyone had access to, without mentioning the underlying assumption that you had to own both of their hardware platforms. To demonstrate the possibilities here, they ran an all-time embarrassing and cringeworthy trailer for the ages to introduce North American audiences to their new GameCube title that would embody all of these connectivity possibilities: Animal Crossing. This trailer would be done in an incredibly awkward style of kids talking to the camera while selling you something akin to an infomercial, while also pretending to be average, normal, hip kids. No disrespect intended to the actors involved here, as watching this trailer, the underlying script would really appear to be the thing making it so stilted and cringe-inducing. But they did check all of the boxes for both explaining what this real-time, cartoonish life sim game was, and explaining all of its unique features, including players being able to visit each other's towns via their respective memory cards, play NES classics within the game, connect to the Game Boy Advance to visit exclusive areas and design new patterns for clothing within the game, as well as using the newly redesigned e-reader device to swipe special sets of Animal Crossing cards to load new content into the game. Weirdly out-of-touch trailers aside, the game was being eagerly awaited as another new and unique franchise from Nintendo, much like Pikmin had been the previous year. To continue on the point about Game Boy Advance connectivity, Iwata also proudly confirmed that big third parties like Square, Electronic Arts, and Sega were also including connectivity features in their GameCube and Game Boy Advance games, and was fairly blatant in saying that this scheme was a win-win for Nintendo and other publishers, since it would only add value and incentivize users to purchase both versions of the game. He also listed some other future uses for the Game Boy Advance link ability, such as using the Game Boy Advance as a motion-sensitive controller with certain motion-sensitive accelerated cartridge games they were working on, and, in fact, would be showing on the E3 show floor. The GBA would also get a next-generation Game Boy camera with the Game Eye camera, which would connect with the GameCube and could put players' faces into games. Something Rare had come remarkably close to doing with Perfect Dark on the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color, but removed at the very last minute in response to anticipated criticism for the game being released very shortly after the Columbine school shootings. But the Game Boy Advance wouldn't be the only new interface for connection to the GameCube they had to show, since they also announced their plans to ship their wireless Wavebird controller not too long after the E3 show, retailing for just $35 US. They would highlight even more big GameCube games they had to show, and would be releasing in 2002, showing trailers for Magical Mirror starring Mickey Mouse, 1080 Snowboarding, Mario Party 4, and Wario World. But Iwata would then coyly tease the audience, remarking on what an amazing lineup this was, but acknowledging that they had not yet shown their big guns, saying, "Don't worry, we have a few more things to show you." At which point Nintendo's most famous face, Shigeru Miyamoto, emerged not on stage, but from the back of the ballroom, showing off the range and usability of the Wavebird controller by controlling a GameCube on stage from the back of the room. He would take the stage accompanied by his translator from Nintendo of America, Bill Trinan, to show off an extensive hands-on look at Super Mario Sunshine, the first sequel in the mold of Super Mario 64, which was due out by the end of summer to coincide with the game's beachside vacation theming. Then he would move on to the even bigger and more controversial title, sarcastically thanking the audience for how much chatter the new redesign of Link had generated across the world. He then proceeded to try and explain from his point of view that although they had not gone with a realistic style of graphics, their latest Zelda game reflected the realistic, expressive nature of adventure through its gameplay. He then proceeded to also demo the new Zelda game in real time, showing a small section from a dungeon and fighting some monsters. Miyamoto then unintentionally teased the audience by saying he had another Zelda game with him, to which the crowd suddenly erupted in cheers, most likely assuming this new cartoon Zelda had been some kind of spin-off or elaborate joke, and that Miyamoto would now pull the real Zelda they wanted out of a hat. Instead, he pulled out a tiny Game Boy Advance cartridge from his pocket and proceeded to explain that the Link to the Past port that they were releasing for the Game Boy Advance would also be including an all-new 4-player Zelda game used by linking up 4 Game Boy Advances via link cables. He then symbolically invited several of his company's new partners on stage to play the game with him, with one of his partners at Capcom that had worked on handheld Zelda games, in addition to a new member of the Namco team working on Star Fox, and the head of Sega's Amusement Visions team that will be working on games for the Triforce board. Toshihiro Nagoshi from the Amusement Visions team would also stay behind on stage after the demo to share some more news. Firstly, that Super Monkey Ball 2 for the GameCube was nearly ready for release and would be on the E3 show floor. And even more excitingly, that Amusement Vision, the current stewards of Sega's Daytona USA racing franchise, will be partnering with Nintendo to develop the latest F-Zero game for both the GameCube and the Triforce arcade board. A remarkably surprising development, and another decisive sign of the end of the long Cold War between Nintendo and Sega. The presentation would then be capped off with a long sizzle reel showing all the third-party titles coming to the GameCube that Nintendo had no involvement in, which showed off a nice diverse smattering of just about every genre that could be expected. The presentation was remarkably well received, certainly more so than in 2001, which had also met with mostly positive reviews at the time, but this time Nintendo had done seemingly everything it could to flex its software muscles and deliver everything fans were asking for, with some notable asterisks. It was promising a holiday season that would feature Mario, Metroid, Star Fox, and Zelda, in addition to some other key franchises like Mario Party. Plus, it was making a legitimate effort to reach out and get games for older, mature audiences like Eternal Darkness and Resident Evil. They were also playing their cards to try and leverage the Game Boy Advance's total monopoly over the handheld market to help the GameCube, and were showing new partnerships right and left with other famous Japanese studios and newly recruited Western ones to augment their own software output. The looming asterisks were that while Zelda still looked like an incredibly solid and enjoyable adventure game in the same vein as its famous predecessors, the cel-shading style was immune to any amount of outcry and backlash, and Nintendo would be sticking to its guns in delivering a playable cartoon. while the rest of the industry was racing towards trying to produce adult-oriented and violent content as realistically as it could. Secondly, compared to the heavy focus Sony and Microsoft were giving online gaming at this E3, Nintendo's meager announcement regarding the topic were a fig leaf so small they really failed to obscure that the Emperor genuinely wasn't wearing any clothes in this case. The Game Boy Advance connectivity looked interesting, but was absolutely no substitute for having online gaming on the system. The Wavebird controller was a genuine hardware triumph, where the company was showing the way towards the future before any of its competitors. But it was more of a footnote accessory for the more hardcore GameCube owners in the know enough to go out and buy one. Some of the other news from the show was not included in the press conference. The biggest of these was that Nintendo was following on in the price war, not allowing its competitors to undercut its low system price, and would be marking the GameCube down from $200 to $150 effective immediately. The other was much further in the background and across the ocean, as the Grand Patriarch of the Nintendo Empire, Hiroshi Yamauchi, would officially retire from the company shortly after the show in May of 2002, to be directly replaced by Satoru Iwata, cementing the end of a 52-year reign at the top of the company, and handing the baton very firmly to a very new and different generation of leader at Nintendo. Lastly, there was a lingering question in the air regarding one of Nintendo's biggest partners, as many rumors have been circulating around the industry in the last year that Rare, which Nintendo had only a 49% stake in, was looking for someone to buy up the rest of the company for good, insulating them from the vagaries of the marketplace and helping them to be better equipped to handle the higher and higher costs of game development. But to date, nothing had been officially announced by either Nintendo or Rare. The fact Rare's presentation at E3 2001 consisted of several titles, and this year appeared to just consist of Star Fox Adventures, certainly was being noticed. Cameo Elements of Power had been playable at E3 2001 and was cited as releasing in 2002, and yet was nowhere to be seen. There was no further word on the announced Donkey Kong Racing. When asked about the rumors regarding a breakup between Rare and Nintendo, Nintendo of America spokespeople would simply state that all was status quo between Nintendo and Rare, and that was it. On the show floor itself, Nintendo of course brought to bear all of the games it had just touted in its press conference, but several other things were buried among their booth, the largest at the show. One was a demonstration title called Donkey Kong Plus, meant to show off connectivity between the GameCube and Game Boy Advance, and appeared to be a kind of spiritual successor to the Donkey Kong 94 remake on the original Game Boy. They also showed some interactive demos of their connectivity featuring a motion tilt sensing Game Boy Advance cartridge for something called Roll-O-Rama, which appeared to be the Kirby tilting game that they had shown last year with all traces of Kirby removed. They also had the more extravagant stage debut on hand to demonstrate using the announced Game Eye camera to map players' faces onto an interactive dance demo, which appeared to borrow and build heavily upon the ideas from the Japanese-only Mario Artist series on the stillborn Nintendo 64 disk drive platform. While Roll-O-Rama appeared to be the framework of a game, it was far from clear how exactly Stage Debut could be packaged and sold as a game product. But then again, the Mario Artist series wasn't really a game either, more of a creation tool. But the United States hadn't seen one of these in 10 years since Mario Paint. Something completely overlooked and unannounced was that Nintendo was also showing off its own first-party LCD screen for the GameCube, which would plug directly into the digital out port and offer a high-quality but small display for making the system considerably more portable, and following after the example set by Sony's very successful PS1 revision model. They also quietly announced via press release, but not on the show floor itself, that some other GameCube games were moving forward, but North American releases were still up in the air. One was an RPG called Gift Pia, which very little was known about yet. The other was a GameCube version of another Nintendo 64 disk drive title, the God game Doshin the Giant, which was reportedly being translated to English, but thus far appeared to only be on its way to Europe. A North American release was still a big question mark. Much like E3 2001, third parties brought plenty of ports from other systems, or at least games that they confirmed would be ported to the GameCube, even if they were being shown on the PS2. This would include the requisite licensed games like Nickelodeon games, Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, Scooby-Doo, and Shrek. All of the different sports franchises this year from Sega, EA, Acclaim, and others. Cross-platform original titles like Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, Time Splitters 2, Vex, Smuggler's Run 2, and Dragon's Lair 3D. There would this year be a smattering of GameCube exclusive titles from third parties, though. A few of Sega's studios would stand by Nintendo, with the aforementioned Phantasy Star Online and Super Monkey Ball 2 being joined by some exclusive sports games, such as Virtua Striker 2002 and Beach Spikers. There were already the announced GameCube exclusive Resident Evil games from Capcom, the recently released remake of the original, and the upcoming Resident Evil 0. Konami had the rights from Disney to publish a series of Disney sports games, which it had chosen to focus exclusively on the GameCube. A pretty simple bet on the demographics of Nintendo's audience that they probably wish Konami hadn't made that year. As well as a few scattered others, such as Majesco publishing the latest Bomberman adventure, following on from the N64 games, Bomberman Generation. Infogrames showing a GameCube exclusive kaiju fighting game, Godzilla Destroy All Monsters. Ubisoft making sort of an exclusive RPG, depending on how you view two Dreamcast games combined together, from the Evolution World of Sacred Device series. Sierra Entertainment was, for some reason, showing a GameCube exclusive first-person shooter utilizing the Die Hard movie license, Die Hard Vendetta, while Eidos was testing its Fresh Games sub-label of publishing with a more raunchy and irreverent arcade-style game called Swingers Golf, also exclusive to the GameCube. There was little coherent pattern to third-party support here. It was an improvement over last year that there were some exclusive titles for the GameCube that Nintendo themselves didn't have to have a hand in, but they were a precious few. They reeked of toes being dipped into the water, and aside from the Resident Evil deal struck with Capcom, none of these titles were really the big-name, head-turning games the GameCube actually needed to draw major attention away from its competitors. So this is what Nintendo had up its sleeve. This was its big plan to make the GameCube a hit. They seemed to figure, with a Nintendo 64, it had taken too long to get all of their big games out, and spread themselves way too thin with too little third-party support to fill in the gaps. So now they promised to hit the market with a blitz of most of their biggest games and biggest names all coming out in one holiday season window, followed with healthy third-party support and more mature titles to try and change its image. It was still refusing to go along with the industry in some other ways, particularly online gaming, and its third-party support was still a long shot from Sony or even Microsoft, but it had also come a long way from the Nintendo 64 days as well, when most of the companies that they were now working with, again, had abandoned them. But Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time were once-in-a-lifetime moments when the underlying technology behind games changed in a massive paradigm shift. That was no longer the case now. Would a new Mario and Zelda hold the same impact as their precursors? Would a few M-rated games really be able to turn the tide of perception? Would finally releasing network adapters for the GameCube kickstart some kind of online gaming renaissance from an obviously reluctant Nintendo? What kind of new ideas were developers coming up for with this Game Boy Advance connectivity? We'll find out the answers to all of these things, one game at a time, on this series we call ChronCube.